Not the kind that sits in bank accounts, or gets listed in financial reports, or earns a spot on a magazine's richest page. The kind that matters most lives somewhere else entirely. It lives in the years a mother spent standing under bright lights, giving everything she had to a song, while the people she loved most waited quietly in the wings, hoping she would come home soon. Céline Dion built something that most people only dream about, a fortune that stretched into the hundreds of millions, sold-out residencies that ran for years without slowing down. A voice so rare, so deeply human, that it became the emotional soundtrack to an entire generation's most important moments. The weddings, the funerals, the first loves, the long and painful goodbyes. People heard her voice and felt something they couldn't quite name, something true, but here is what almost nobody talks about. The money was never the real story, it never was. Behind every number, behind every sold-out arena, and every platinum record hanging on a wall, there was a family doing its best to hold everything together. A husband who poured his own belief, his own security, his own life into hers. Three young sons growing up in the long shadow of a legend who also happened to be their mother. And a woman who, despite everything the world placed at her feet, would face losses so deep that no fortune, no matter how vast, could have softened the blow. And then, when the grief had barely begun to settle, came a diagnosis that changed the shape of everything. A rare neurological condition, a voice forced into silence, a legacy left uncertain. And a family quietly trying to understand what all of it actually meant, not as admirers, not as the public watching from a distance, but as the people who sat beside her when the cameras were gone. When the lights were off, when it was just them. This is not a story about wealth. It is a story about what we leave behind when everything else has been stripped away. And about the question that no amount of success can ever fully answer, whether any of it in the end is truly enough. She came into the world in a small town in Quebec, Canada, in 1968, the youngest of 14 children in a family that had very little money but more music than they knew what to do with. The Dion home was loud in the best possible way. It was full. Full of voices and movement, and the kind of warmth that only grows in a house where people have learned, over many years, to find joy in what they have rather than sadness in what they don't. Her mother, Therese, played the violin, her father, Ed Hamer, played the accordion. Music in that house wasn't something you pursued. It wasn't a career plan or a distant ambition. It was simply part of living, part of breathing. Céline started singing almost before she understood what singing was. By 5, she was performing for family. By 12, she had recorded a demo tape, a song written by her mother and one of her brothers that would somehow find its way into the hands of a music manager named René Angelil. René was in his late 30s. He had spent years in the industry. He had heard talented people before, and he knew the difference between potential and something rare. When he heard that tape, according to those who were close to him at the time, something in him shifted in a way he hadn't expected. He reportedly mortgaged his own home to fund her first album. He put his own security on the line for a 12-year-old girl he had never met before that tape arrived. That single act of belief would quietly reshape both of their lives in ways neither of them could have possibly seen coming. She became a star first in the French-speaking world, then across Europe, and then steadily and undeniably across the entire planet. By the time the 1990s arrived, Céline Dion had moved beyond fame. She had become something closer to a cultural force. Her voice carried a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has never stopped and truly listened to it, not just heard it in passing, but actually listened. It held grief and hope in the same breath. Strength folded gently around something deeply vulnerable. It reached into people and stayed there. And through every step of all of it, René was there. He was her manager first, then her mentor, and eventually. After years of working side by side through the early mornings and the exhausting late nights, and the slow climb toward something neither of them had a name for yet, her husband. Their relationship drew attention when it became public. The age gap between them, more than 2 decades, made people ask questions. But those who knew them well described something that was quietly impossible to dismiss. A real partnership. A devotion that was not just romantic but purposeful. A connection built on shared sacrifice and a shared belief in something larger than either of them alone. They married in 1994 in a ceremony that felt, to those who witnessed it, less like a celebrity occasion and more like the natural conclusion of a story that had been building slowly and surely. For well over a decade. And for a while, for a fragile, luminous while, everything seemed to be exactly where it was supposed to be. The late 1990s were when everything truly accelerated, when the life they had built together began moving at a speed that was almost hard to follow. The Titanic soundtrack arrived in 1997, and with it, a song that did something most music never manages to do. It stopped being entertainment and became something else entirely. My Heart Will Go On became one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. And it placed Celine's voice at the center of a shared cultural moment that hundreds of millions of people around the world experienced at the same time. Awards followed one after another. Records were broken and then broken again. A kind of fame arrived that almost no artist is ever able to sustain for long, and yet somehow she sustained it. By the early 2000s, she and Renee had made a decision that would define the next chapter of their lives in a profound way. Rather than continuing to move from city to city on an endless cycle of touring, they negotiated a residency deal in Las Vegas that was, at that point in time, unlike anything a pop artist had done before. A theater built specifically for her, a guaranteed run that would bring the audience to her rather than sending her endlessly out into the world. It worked far beyond what anyone had allowed themselves to expect. The residency ran for years, generating the kind of income that pushed her estimated net worth into territory that only a small number of musicians in the entire history of the industry had ever reached. Depending on the year and the source, estimates placed her fortune somewhere between $600 million and over $1 billion. Real estate on multiple continents. Business interests beyond the music itself. Recordings that had been made decades earlier still generating royalties, still finding new listeners, still earning. But what gets lost when people focus only on those numbers, and it gets lost easily, is how deliberately and carefully she and Renee chose to structure their actual lives. They had children. 3 sons, Renee Charles, born in 2001, and then the twins, Nelson and Eddie, born in 2010. And those boys were not raised in the kind of chaotic, untethered environment that so often surrounds the children of the very famous. There were routines, there was consistency. There was a quiet intentionality to how Céline and Renee approached being parents, even while the demands of her career remained relentless and enormous. People who worked closely alongside the family during those years have spoken about a home environment that was, for all its obvious luxury, genuinely grounded in the same values she had carried with her from that loud, full house in Quebec. The togetherness, the warmth, the unspoken understanding that no matter how vast and loud the world outside became, the family inside the walls was the thing that held everything else in place. But even that stability, as beautiful and deliberate as it was, had already begun to develop fractures that no one could yet see. In 2014, René Angelil was diagnosed with throat cancer. It was not the first time he had faced it. Years earlier, he had fought the disease and won, and so when it returned, there was reason, at least on the surface, at least in those first difficult weeks, for something resembling cautious hope. But this time was different. The people close to him seemed to understand that before any official word was given, Céline pulled back from her schedule. She reduced her commitments significantly, quietly rearranging the shape of her professional life to be present with the man who had shaped everything about her adult years. According to reports from that period, it was not just a matter of a wife supporting her husband through illness. It was deeper than that. She was watching her partner, her creative partner, her life partner, the person who had believed in her voice before almost anyone else in the world had heard it, fighting for his survival one difficult day at a time. He fought in the way that people fight when they know exactly what they are fighting for. But the treatments were aggressive and the decline came in stages, each one harder than the last. And throughout all of it, Céline kept appearing in public, kept performing when she was able to, kept holding herself together with a kind of emotional discipline that very few people would have been capable of in her position. Then, in August of that same year, barely weeks after Renée's diagnosis had become public knowledge, her brother Daniel was diagnosed with cancer as well. The weight of that timing is almost impossible to sit with. The woman who had grown up as the youngest of 14 children, surrounded by family her entire life, was now watching 2 of the most important men she had ever known fighting the same invisible and relentless war at the very same time. Daniel passed away in January 2016. René Angelil passed away 2 days later. 2 days. For anyone close to the family, there are simply no words that do justice to that period, 48 hours. A brother and a husband, the man who had traded his own security for a chance to believe in her, Gone, both of them gone within the span of 2 days, and yet she returned to the stage. Not right away, but she returned, because somewhere in the grief she understood that going back was the most honest tribute she could offer. Because the stage was, in some quiet and aching way, the one place left where she could still feel close to him. When Renee passed, the questions that followed were inevitable. They always are when a fortune of that scale is suddenly in motion without the person who helped build and shape it. Renee had not simply been Celine's husband. He had been the architect of the entire financial and professional structure that surrounded her career. For more than 3 decades, he had been deeply involved in the decisions, the contracts, the management of her earnings and her image and her direction. His death did not only create an emotional void, profound as that was. It created an operational one as well, a gap in the infrastructure of her professional life that had no obvious or easy answer. According to reports, Renee's personal estate was substantial: property in Las Vegas, holdings in Canada, financial assets built carefully over a lifetime in the music industry. And navigating all of that, the legal complexity, the financial decisions, the restructuring, while grieving deeply and raising 3 sons, placed Celine in a position that the public largely observed from the outside, without fully appreciating what it actually required of her. She made changes, she brought in new management. She restructured aspects of her professional life and made financial decisions that reflected both the reality of what she was facing and her clear determination to protect and preserve what she owned. Renee had spent their lives building together. But the world was watching, as it always watches when significant wealth changes hands or changes form. And when questions arise, some raised openly, some kept carefully private, about how assets of that scale should be managed and who should have influence over those decisions. The emotional weight on the person at the center of it all becomes something that deserves far more consideration than it tends to receive. There were, according to certain reports, people in her broader circle who held strong feelings about the direction of those financial decisions. The details remained largely out of the public eye, as they perhaps should, but the pressure of navigating all of that, while still in the middle of grief that had no clean timeline, was real. And it was heavy, and it was hers to carry largely alone. Then came the news that changed the shape of everything once more. In December 2022, Céline Dion publicly disclosed that she had been diagnosed with stiff person syndrome, a neurological condition so rare that it is estimated to affect perhaps 1 in every million people worldwide. The disease causes progressive muscle rigidity and severe, unpredictable spasms that can be completely debilitating. According to medical experts who have spoken about it publicly, the condition is still not fully understood by the medical community, has no known cure, and can, in its more advanced stages, significantly affect a person's ability to perform even basic daily functions, including, for a woman whose entire identity was built around it, the ability to sing. The implications of that for her specifically are almost too large to hold in a single thought. She had been quietly managing symptoms for longer than the public realized. The tour cancellations in 2021 and 2022, which had been attributed at the time to other health concerns, were now understood differently. She had been fighting something serious and deeply uncertain, something still being mapped by the very doctors treating her. While continuing to appear before the world with the same composed and careful presence that had always defined her public life. The documentary released in 2024, I Am, Céline Dion, brought the public closer to the truth of what that fight actually looked like. It was not easy to watch. Footage of a severe episode, unfiltered, raw, quietly devastating, showed something that no press statement or carefully managed interview could have communicated. According to those who watched it, the film did not leave audiences feeling pity. It left them with something that felt much closer to deep, wordless respect. Her sons were watching their mother fight, her family gathered around her. And the fortune that had once served as the measure of everything she had achieved, every sacrifice, every performance, every year on the road, now existed in a completely different context. Because the one thing she needed most, her health, was the one thing that all of it together could not simply go out and purchase. There is a particular kind of weight that comes with great wealth when it exists inside a family that has also known great loss. The two things do not balance each other. They do not cancel each other out. They simply exist together, uneasily, asking questions that have no clean answers. Celine's 3 sons, René Charles, now in his early 20s, and the twins, Nelson and Eddie, who are still teenagers, grew up watching their mother become one of the most recognized voices in the world. They also grew up watching their father deteriorate and die. They watched their mother walk back onto a stage just weeks after burying two people she loved more than anything. And now, as they are still figuring out who they are and who they want to be, they are watching her fight an illness that carries no clear timeline and no guaranteed ending. What does a fortune mean to children who have lived through all of that? What does any of it mean when you have seen this much loss up close? According to people close to the family, Céline has been very intentional about how she speaks to her sons about what they will one day carry forward. Not just the financial inheritance, which by any honest measure will provide for them in ways that most people on earth will never experience, but the other inheritance, the quieter one. The values she grew up with in Quebec, the work ethic that kept her on a stage through personal grief that would have stopped most people entirely. The understanding that everything, the voice, the career, the records, the residencies, was built on sacrifice and belief, and a kind of love that was both deeply personal and fiercely professional at the same time. René Charles has shown a genuine interest in music. He has performed publicly, and the thread connecting him to what his parents built together is visible to anyone who is paying attention. Whether that path continues to develop remains to be seen, but it is there. The twins are still young. Their full relationship with the legacy they are growing up inside, the fame, the fortune, the loss, the illness, all of it is still forming. And perhaps that is as it should be. Some things cannot and should not be understood all at once. What is clear, from everything that has been observed and reported, is that Céline's deepest concern has never been the number. The estimate, the figure cited in financial publications. Her concern has been the people, the family. The continuation of something that began long before the fame arrived. In a full and loud and music-filled home in Quebec, where 14 children grew up understanding that joy is something you make, not something you wait for. That is the fortune that truly matters, and it is also, without question, the hardest one to protect. There are stories that show us what success looks like from the outside. And then there are stories that show us, slowly and honestly, what success feels like from the inside, when life keeps asking its hardest questions and the answers don't come easily. Céline Dion's story is both of those things at once, and it has never been one without the other. She built something extraordinary starting from almost nothing. From a large and musical family in a town most of the world had never heard of. From a demo tape that could have easily never reached the right hands. From the belief of one man who was willing to risk everything he had on a voice he heard coming from a cassette in an envelope. She built a legacy that spans decades, crosses continents, and has now passed itself quietly into the next generation. She gave the world music that people carried into their most important moments and their hardest ones. She filled arenas. She broke records that had stood for years. She accumulated a fortune so large that most people could not meaningfully imagine spending it in a single lifetime. And then she buried her brother. And 2 days later, she buried her husband. And then her own body began turning against her in ways she had not chosen and cannot fully control, in ways that the most advanced medicine in the world is still working to understand. What does it mean to build everything, and then be asked by life itself, quietly and without apology, to look at everything and understand what it actually is? There is no clean answer to that question, and the fact that there isn't is, maybe, the most honest and human thing about this entire story. What we do know is that she did not disappear. She did not retreat into the silence that grief and illness might have given her every reason to choose. She made a documentary that showed the world her most vulnerable moments without trying to soften them. She spoke openly about a diagnosis that most people would have hidden for as long as possible. She allowed the world to see her not as a legend, not as a fortune, not as a voice that belongs on a greatest hits list, but as a person, a mother. A woman who is still, one careful day at a time, working out what comes next. Her sons are watching her do that. Every single day they are watching her. And whatever they inherit, the catalog, the royalties, the properties, the names, the most lasting and most valuable thing they will carry with them, is something that cannot be listed in any document. It is the image of a woman who, when everything around her became uncertain and frightening and unclear, looked at all of it and chose, again and again, not to hide. That kind of legacy does not lose its value over time. It does not need managing or protecting or restructuring. It does not appear in a will, and it cannot be divided or disputed. It passes the way all the most important things pass, quietly, through memory, through presence, through the slow and sometimes painful process of watching someone you love decide every morning to keep going. Céline Dion's story is not finished. No one can say with certainty what the next chapter holds or how long it will take to arrive or what shape it will take when it does. But everything it has already been, every note, every loss, every act of courage that the cameras did and did not catch, that belongs to all of us now. And it always will. If this story sat with you for a moment after you heard it, that is worth paying attention to. Think about what legacy means in your own life, not the wealth, not the recognition, but the quieter and more lasting things. What you leave inside people. What you build in the spaces where no one is watching. If something in this video felt real to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories here, stories about extraordinary lives, about love and loss and the kind of resilience that doesn't announce itself. Stories about what remains when everything else has fallen away. And if this one moved you, leave a comment, say what you took from it. Those conversations, small as they may seem, matter more than you might think.